Welcome, everybody, to this fantastic session. I'm just going to frame it really quickly, and then I'm going to introduce our speakers. The plan is that we're going to give each of our speakers 20 minutes to present and to talk, up to 20 minutes. Any time that we have left at the end will be question-answer format. We'll reserve at least 15 minutes, and if you have a question toward the end, feel free to line up behind that mic right there. We do need all questions to be asked into a microphone so that we catch them, the audio on the video that's being recorded there. If you have a question but either don't want to or can't stand up here, that's fine. Just raise your hand and I can bring the mic to you. I'm really honored and grateful to be introducing this session. I think this question, the question that our panelists are all going to be speaking to in slightly different and sometimes very different ways, but that are interconnected. What makes a person is one of the most fundamental questions that you could have. I remember writing about this question, and I didn't get a chance to tell you this, Jeff, but I remember writing about this question as an undergraduate. I wrote a paper on hylomorphism and postmortem survival, and I went home and I told my parents, and they said, who needs to know about that? And I said, everyone. I didn't understand how this could be an irrelevant question to someone. And I think increasingly in today's world, we can see the relevance of the question in different ways. And one of those ways is the advancement of technology, which many of our presenters are going to be speaking on today. So our first speaker is Jeffrey P. Bishop, MD, PhD. He's professor of philosophy at St. Louis University, where he holds the Tenet Endowed Chair in Bioethics. I am going to welcome him. I ask you to join me in welcoming him to the microphone.
Thanks. I'm surprised to see so many people here because they're talking about transgender stuff next door, and I thought no one is going to come to our talk. All right, so let's just get started because I don't have a lot of time. I want to say I'm proceeding as a philosopher, and I'm doing something I normally don't do. I normally ask questions of science and technology and then try to figure out what would we have to believe about the human being in order for this piece of science or this technology to actually be something we think is legitimate. So I'm trying to understand how the technology manifests a kind of understanding of what it means to be a human person. That's normally what I do. Today I'm going to be a little bit more on the creative side and do a little bit more exploration. So I normally am critical. I'm going to try to be constructive for once. All right, so we normally categorize, what kind of thing are we? What do we think we are? And normally we say Homo sapiens. That's the thing that pops out, the wise animal, the rational animal. Or sometimes we say the Homo Faber, the tool-making animal, right? Or we say Homo religiosus. That's one that anthropologists have put out there, which is really what I think they mean by that is the culture-making animal more than it is the religious animal. And then and I'm going to say, well, maybe we are the Homo cultus. And cultus there means worship in Latin, so maybe we are the worshiping animal. So I'm trying to move in that direction, but philosophically, not theologically. Okay, so I already said the kind of thing I normally do. I take medicine, science, and technology as products of culture, and then I show how they come to produce culture. So they make culture, and then they turn around and they're made by a culture, and they turn around and make culture at the same time. So I start typically from the tools and toys and cultural practices to ask questions about what do we have to believe about ourselves in order for those tools and practices and toys to be legitimate, okay? So normally I try to say, I want to understand. I need to diagnose the current situation before I can be constructive. So I think I've diagnosed it. I'm going to move on to the constructive piece. All right, so typically, we think of ourselves as the rational animal or the wise animal. So it takes our rational capacities as the crown of our ability. Reason allows us to work out problems, and today we take reason to be aimed at certain products. So we still think of reason kind of instrumentally here, right? It's either product of bodies of knowledge or it's products of practical reason, right? Culture is products of practical reason. So tradition typically, the Western intellectual tradition has typically split reason into two domains, one of which is speculative and the other is practical, okay? And there's a way that both of these are still instrumentalized even today. So reason as productive, I see reason as productive of culture. It's productive of our tools and our practices, and reason is also productive of knowledge and what we would normally call science, okay? So we have tended to elevate speculative reason over practical reason in the philosophical tradition, in the philosophical Western intellectual tradition. However, we've tended to place practice over the speculative, culturally speaking, okay? So one of them kind of aims at bodies of knowledge, the other at practical things that we can do with knowledge. The other thing that kind of has led us to this Homo sapiens, or this rational animal, is Plato's distinction between episteme and techne, where techne is kind of marginalized and thought to be almost like sophistry, and Aristotle's discussion or distinction between, that kind of sets the epistemological track of the West, okay? And Aristotle makes a distinction between natural and technical beings, and that sets us off on the ontological tradition in the West. But what happens when our tools, the products, the techne, what happens when the tools start to reason, right? In some sense, reason anyway, or it starts to choose our paths of action, all right? So that's kind of the problem that's at the heart of what I'm trying to get at here. Okay. So others have said we are Homo Faber, and we think reason leads to technology, to tools. But what if it's the other way around? So we think we have reason, and therefore we reason our way to make tools. But I wonder if it's the other way around. And I'm going to try to give you some evidence that maybe it is the other way around to some extent. There have been many people that have argued that the human animal is the tool-making animal, and arguing for the practical side begins to ask questions about the foundation of the rational side, okay? So let's look at some of this here. Evolutionarily speaking, hominids develop thumbs and show use of artifacts before the frontal lobes come into being. And so it might be that the fact that we could grab a tool, a stick, and could beat off the animal is the condition for the possibility of the evolution of the frontal lobes, okay? So that kind of changes the way, and if we think about it, there are many animals that use tools, that birds build nests. And we think of that, oh, that's just merely instinct, but it seems like animals solve problems. Birds learn, given a particular set of circumstances in the environment, birds learn how to modify their nest-making practices. Okay, so there's a way in which the techniques, okay, become instrumental in creating reason. Now, I'm going to make another case culturally, in cultural evolution. So life evolves by means other than life. That's a statement made by Bernard Stiegler, a French philosopher of technology. He says, hey, we have a genetic inheritance. And he says that is the memory of our evolutionary past, our biological past, ensconced in the genes, okay? Then we have what he calls the epigenetic inheritance, which is your individual memory, the memories of your particular kinds of experiences. But then he says we have another kind of memory, and that memory is the epiphylogenetic memory, and that is the memory that we take and we put into our technologies, our tools, our writing, for instance. And now it lives beyond. My memory now is not just the memory of my experience, but it's the memory lodged in our tools, in our cultures, so to speak. So our tools, technology is about culture, all right? It provides our cultural inheritance, all right? So culture is what gives us longer memories of who we are as a people. All right. So let's look at some of these. Epic poetry. It's a memory aid. Epic poetry. I mean, you know those books that are super thick? I was talking to Margaret a few minutes ago. I don't think she's in here now. But they're super thick. Homer and Virgil. Well, what do they have there? That's the poem itself, as it's performed, has certain techniques, namely repetition, rhyme, meter, that permits them to learn large swaths of text that just take up volumes of writing, right? So we already see that the techniques are there. Techne is there in the way that we memorize poetry. And when you don't have the tools for writing, that is essential. And in addition to that, you see that language is a kind of tool that allows, and the poetry is a kind of tool that kind of permits a memory. In addition to that, all of the cultural artifacts are built around that kind of art form, that kind of technique, the spoken word. So you see amphitheaters, you see the forum in which they have these buildings in which the voice can be cast in this echo. And so you see in their material culture something that surrounds this ability that we have for memory, repetition, and meter, right? Walter Ong, a professor, he was a professor at St. Louis University. He's since died. He's a Jesuit priest. He says oral cultures have a different way of reasoning, of imagining, for example, time, okay? And they have more of a spiral, repetitive kind of reasoning rather than a strict linear form of reasoning. And I think that's an interesting thing, given that so much of, like, Scripture comes to us from the oral tradition. And you see different orderings of time when you look at these ancient texts, okay? All right, writing. In the Phaedrus, right there, Plato is writing about what do we do with writing? This tool, this technique, it's going to change us, he says, all right? And so he's a little bit wary of it. So this novel tool arrives, paper and pen, all right, chisel, hammer, whatever, a codex, the ability to write, to record, arrives. And then what do we get? A culture that's built around the written word. You get monastic houses that have scriptoria, right? You get libraries as repositories for this experiential learning that has come up to us across the ages, right? The universities have to start to, the universities are built around this form of learning, right? And they start to shift when the printing press comes. So Ong says reasoning with the written word begins to change. It becomes more linear over time. And once we have writing, our powers of memory start to slip away. We start to see that we can't memorize things, okay? So something changes about us with the technology. All right, the printing press is a novel tool that arises that makes the printed word more widely available. And it changes the way we think. And Catherine Pickstock, a theologian at Cambridge, pretty much makes this argument that by having printed surfaces, we start to pay attention to the surface meaning of things, okay? And it's interchangeable. The meaning is right there on the page, okay? And it used to be that we interpreted Scripture in 4 different ways: the allegorical, there was the literal way of interpreting Scripture, but the allegorical, the anagogical, and the tropological way of interpreting Scripture. It was the same way with nature. But she argues that essentially once the printing press comes on, we start to think of reading the surface of Scripture and getting a meaning. And we start to think about nature in the same way. And I might even I have argued in classrooms, I haven't put it in print, but essentially this way of attending to surfaces that then forces us to get rid of allegorical, anagogical, or tropological ways of reading Scripture also forces us to get rid of the anagogical, allegorical, and the tropological interpretation of nature. And so in a way, we become scripture literalists, and in science, we become scientific literalists, as if we can read nature on the surface, off the surface. All right, so what are we going to become with these new tools? Social media, TikTok, Facebook, Twitter, etc. And where do we go? What happens to reason when we are pushing things off onto ChatGPT? What happens to reason when the chatbots are doing our writing for us, when we now no longer know how to write? So we don't have the oral tradition of kind of this spiraling kind of reason, a tangential approach, nor are we going to have the linear approach that writing and print books have given us, right? So what kind of reasoning is going to happen? Some people have speculated that we might need to move back to the old form of disputations in the classroom, right? And that might then change the way we reason yet again, okay? All right, so what I'm trying to say is that in a way, culture begins to drive the evolution of human life in some sense. So we have an evolution of life by means other than life, by culture, okay? All right, some people have said we're the religious animal, and these terms have taken on a more spatialized way of thinking. Religion belongs to the sphere of the private life. We mostly always say that's true. And then the secular belongs to the public life, okay? It also, in anthropologists, you see a distinction between the sacred and the profane spaces. Eliade also has a spatialized way of thinking, the sacred or the religious space and the profane and the mundane space. But he argues that this is actually how cultures are formed. There's always this. So he's not so much talking about what we mean by religious as he's talking about the way cultures form. All right, there's a lot more that could be said about this. I'm going to skip this. Oh, I want to say this, though. Religion, we think of religion as a kind of thing, a body of knowledge, a body of beliefs, right? We think of religion as existing in space. It's a noun, okay? But that is different from religio, the Latin, which is an activity, a habit, a virtue, actually a sub-virtue of justice, and it's a verb, okay? All right, so secular space we think of as a thing as well. Science gives us a body of knowledge. The secular is a space. It's a noun. However, the word saeculum is the predecessor word of saeculum, from which we get secular, is a Proto-Indo-European word called sha'ai, okay, something like that, and it's a verb, okay? It's a practice. Both of these words mean to bind. Religio means to bind, and sha'ai means to bind across time. Saeculum actually is a unit of time in Latin, not a unit of space, okay, which is fascinating. All right, so religion and the secular are spaces as we mean it today. William Kavanaugh, a theologian at, I think he's at DePaul. No, yeah, he's at DePaul. Essentially argues that they're both twins born as we mean them today. They're both twins born of the nation state. They're tools of governance. They are colonial powers. But religio is a sub-virtue of justice, and it literally means to bind together. It's a symbolic action. It's a verb. It's a habit that shaking hands is a habit. Every time that's going to happen. If he doesn't put his hand up to shake my hand, it says friendship is ruptured. But shaking hands says we're okay. The Japanese tea ceremony is a symbolic action that welcomes the other in and says, I'm not going to harm you. And we see this in the Eucharist. It's our bind to God, okay? It's how we're bound to God. Saeculum, the unit of time. I've already said this. So these things are activities rather than nouns. They're verbs rather than nouns. They're habits rather than settled things. All right. Culture, likewise, as we mean it today, is a product. That's what we usually talk about. Oh, it's our culture. We mean a noun. However, the word culture derives from the term cultus, which in Latin, Margaret knows what it means to worship. It's a verb. Cultus, worship, is a non-instrumental activity. And thus, it is not merely about purpose, but about meaning, about the meaning of the human being. Okay, so all of you who are Roman Catholic, you go to the Mass, and these prayers pop up. Blessed are you, Lord God of all creation. Through your goodness, we receive this bread which we now offer you, fruit of the earth, work of human hands. Look at that. Fruit of the earth, nature, work of human hands, culture, and it becomes something different, the bread of life, right? Same thing for the wine. But guess what? Fruit of the nature, the wheat, has been cultivated for years. So even that which we call nature is in part product of human activity. All right, so here we have the Eucharist being celebrated by the Ecumenical Patriarch. I'm Orthodox. By the Ecumenical Patriarch and by Pope Francis here. All right, and what do we see? We see bread, fruit of the earth. We see wine, fruit of the vine. We see tools and utensils. We see chalices. We see material culture. Those chalices just aren't anything. They have to be blessed. They have to be made out of precious metals, right? Why? Because it's about the whole process of culture coming together. Not merely reason, but culture orienting us to something other than the products of practical reason. All right, so perhaps the human should be understood in terms of something non-instrumental, something that one does for its own sake, right? So perhaps all of our activities should be thought of as worship. And so it means that maybe what the scientist is doing is not just producing a body of knowledge, but engaging in an activity. And scientists will tell you, you have to be very precise. You have to have very ritualistic behaviors to get that pipette, to get it just perfectly. Bill probably knows all about how you got to get your scientific technique down, your technologies down, in order to get your experiments to work, in order to try to get nature to reveal what nature. But if the scientist goes too far, if they are irreverent, they might actually kill the thing that they're looking for. So maybe we need to think science is a worshipful activity, because we have to have some sort of reverence for the other being that is there. Same way with political reasoning. Imagine if our politicians thought of themselves as engaged in an act of worship when they were approaching the other. I'll end there.
Oh, man, thank you so much. That was fantastic. And I've already deleted my TikTok account. Our next speaker is Mark Cherry. I didn't delete the TikTok account. All right. Our next speaker is Mark Cherry. Mark Cherry is the Dr. Patricia A. Hayes Professor in Applied Ethics and Professor of Philosophy at St. Edward's University in Austin, Texas. His research encompasses ethics, bioethics, and political philosophy. He is the author of many books and journal articles, editor-in-chief of Healthcare Ethics, and co-editor of the book series The Annals of Bioethics from Routledge, and the editor of the book series Philosophical Studies in Contemporary Culture. Please join me in welcoming him to the microphone.
So some basic bad news. All of my sons have since graduated from high school and moved on, so I don't have anyone to prepare PowerPoint presentations for me anymore. This is a set of reflections on some puzzles I've been having about technology and the implications of technology and the inability of the secular world to actually be able, even in principle, to grasp some of what's taking place in that technology. It's an issue about brain transplantation. Brain transplants for a long time have been no more than the subject of science fiction and engaging thought experiments with undergraduates. It's lots of fun to do, right? But no more. We've got a couple of neuroscientists in Italy and China who've announced their intention to transplant the head of a volunteer onto a donated body. The project is given a rather dubious moniker. They call it HEAVEN, Head Anastomosis Venture. The idea is basically to live essentially indefinitely. Response to the proposed head transplant has been decidedly mixed. But how should we think about the moral permissibility of head transplants? Is it a life-saving, life-enhancing opportunity that appropriately expands the boundaries of medical science? Or is it a bioethical morass that ought not to be attempted? Now, for the purposes of this presentation, I'm going to set aside all practical questions about whether, in fact, they can actually carry it out. I'm not interested in that. I'm a philosopher. The analysis begins instead with an exploration of the embodiment of persons. It argues that persons can be conceptually distinguished from all parts of their bodies, even though at the moment they can only be physically separated from most. In many cases, replacing specific body parts with reasonably similar natural or artificial parts will not destroy the conditions for sustaining embodiment and existence as a person. However, as I explore the phenomenology of personhood is such that some physical changes may empirically prove to be too significant successfully to maintain the same personal identity over time. Now, secular bioethics, we should obviously recognize, appreciates the human person and the human body rather differently than a morality or metaphysics grounded in an authentic experience of God. After all, secular bioethics denies God's existence and rejects religious understandings of the goodness and the proper uses of the body. Without God, there is neither foundational guiding telos for human life and personal flourishing, nor is there any solid ground for morality. Confronted with an irreducible plurality of competing moral perspectives, secular bioethics routinely is only ever able to frame analyses of personal choices and life-altering medical interventions in terms of imminent goods and individual interests. It understands the human body as having value and meaning only insofar as persons value the body and provide it with purpose. From within such a limited framework, secular bioethics is unable to experience the blessed and sanctified nature of the human body. So they're going to approach this whole technological issue radically differently than a traditional Christian would. Some initial observations. If the goal of head transplantation is to provide a life-saving or life-enhancing operation, then one must step back and ask very basic questions regarding whose life is it that one intends to save or enhance, and what exactly would that mean? While discussion typically focuses on maintaining the head donor's personal identity, other goals are surely possible, such as preserving the body donor's ability to reproduce. Insofar as the goal is to preserve the personal life of the head donor, then answers to questions regarding the survival of personal identity over time in different bodily instantiations through potentially very traumatic personal physical changes are essential. Assuming successful transplant, for example, does the personal identity of the head donor survive the transplant? And as I'm going to argue, I think that's more puzzling than one might think. Because if so, how would that survival be experienced? And in what sense would the head donor be the same person? If only think of it like this, if only the brain itself is transplanted, then the individual who survives looks totally identical to the body donor. Right? It's just this much little bit of brain matter that gets transplanted. Can an individual be so completely divorced from his body and still survive as that same person? Roughly speaking, persons secular philosophical analysis would appreciate as something like rational beings that possess sufficient cognitive capacities to understand themselves in a self-conscious, self-reflexive way. As John Locke noted, a person is, quote, a thinking, intelligent being that has reason and reflection and can understand itself as itself, the same thinking self at different times and places, which it does only by that consciousness which is inseparable from thinking, and it seems to be essential to it. Immanuel Kant recognized that being a person also required moral agency. One must be the author of one's actions and possess the capacity, at least in principle, to appreciate one's actions as praiseworthy or blameworthy. As self-conscious, rational, embodied beings, persons depend on some, but not all, of their body parts. Persons can be conceptually distinguished from all parts of their body, even if they can only be physically separated from most. While I experience my body as me, we must make distinctions even there. Some parts are necessary for embodiment and existence as a person, the brain. Still others are necessary for adequate human functioning, heart and lungs. Other parts are neither, the appendix, the gallbladder. My gallbladder was yanked out by a guy with a sharp knife a number of years ago. I've not missed it. In fact, I'm probably better off, right? Some parts are directly experienced, hands and feet. Others are not, hair. Well, I haven't got much, well, down here, but I still don't experience it directly. It's an indirect. Some parts only are directly experienced when pain reveals disease or injury, like a kidney injury, right? Body parts that are necessary conditions for being embodied in the world possess a kind of a unique status. Destroying those body parts is equivalent to killing persons. However, insofar as particular body parts can be removed or replaced without a substantial loss in the range of embodied function typical of persons, it becomes more plausible to understand such parts as things that can be replaced with similar parts, which can be brought into and integrated into the bodily integrity and experiential life of the person. Body parts are experienced within the sphere of the self as intimate to one's life world. Parts that are not essential for embodiment and existence are in principle replaceable without raising important questions of personal identity or loss of personhood. This is what makes organ transplant work, right? We can transplant a liver or transplant a kidney, and we don't notice a change in the transplant recipient's personal identity. It's the same person before and after. In short, here we can, in principle, distinguish between the self and the body, one from the other, even if self and body cannot always be physically separated from each other. Sustaining the life of a person requires maintaining the necessary cognitive capacities that permit the embodiment of this self-conscious, self-reflexive, rational moral being to endure, or at least it would seem. So, unlike other body parts, for example, the brain is the seat of human consciousness, memory, cognitive capacities, the things that sustain personhood. Removal of the brain, especially the higher brain and its cognitive functions, demonstrably destroys the necessary conditions for the embodiment and the existence of the person. As a seat of human personhood, successful brain transplantation implies the person whose brain was transplanted has a new body. It implies if you take my brain from here and you transplant it there, I'm over there. But I want to be puzzled about that a bit more. Perhaps not all would be as expected. Consider, for example, the following sort of circumstance. Imagine a situation in which the brain of a male patient, such as me, is transplanted into a female body whose brain was damaged beyond repair, but who has a salvageable body. Am I now female? Am I now over there, but female? The plausibility of such a conclusion depends in part on the underlying neurobiology. There is significant empirical data, for example, detailing sex-linked differences in brain development, which suggests a rather more complex outcome. It depends also, in part, on important philosophical considerations. Are our concepts and experiences of personal identity flexible enough to encompass such a dramatic cross-sex body change? Assuming that the male person whose brain is transplanted to the female body fully integrates into this new embodiment, what would it mean to say he is the same person? If my brain is now in a female body, in what sense am I female and still the same person? That's quite an odd thought, right? While it's true that the human body presents itself as something to be lived in, to be enlivened, it is experienced distinctly as a male body or a female body. This difference in lived embodiment over the course of one's life has a significant impact on brain development, sense of self, social experience of the world, and personal identity. Men and women occupy quite different life worlds. They experience and know the world differently because of their varied embodied experience. Such differing embodiment leads to separate challenges faced in puberty, such as for males, the deepening of one's voice and the important growth of facial hair, obviously, and learning to control testosterone-driven aggression as compared to the development of breasts, the beginning of menstruation amongst females. The two sexes possess dissimilar first-hand knowledge. Mothers will be more accurately than fathers to be able to describe what it is to experience pregnancy, its problems, its potentials, its challenges, its wonders. Men never, ever have first-hand personal experience of gestating, giving birth to, or nursing a baby, or the various consequences of living through menopause. My experiential lived knowledge of social interactions is always and always has been the experience of a male. I cannot even in principle in this fashion know, although it can be described for me, how a woman might have experienced the same situations. What's interesting is to go to parties with my wife. And we come home and we discuss on the way home what has happened, and I discover we've been to different places. even if we were talking to the same people. She sees things I don't see, she notices things I don't notice, and vice versa. And it's remarkable how different the life world is, even in that kind of very limited sense. Right? Well, it is true that if a male's brain were successfully transplanted into a female body, and if it were properly integrated, he might come to experience the world through that female body. His past knowledge of the world, reactions to physical and emotional stimuli, as well as a lifetime of habitual responses, are all male. The adult brain is not simply a blank slate on which one may write any particular account of behavior, interests, or desires. The brain would have been formed in utero and throughout his life infused with testosterone, this predominantly male steroid hormone, which plays an important role in male behavior. So even if his brain were to be transplanted to a female body, it would very likely remain a male brain. Now, for secular bioethics, concepts of male or female tend to be looser, tend to be more historically, socially, and culturally derived, and as a result, what it would mean in such a case to be gendered male or female, they might say would depend at least on part of the choices of the persons involved, they might say. But amongst the central puzzles is whether some physical changes such as cross-brain transplantation are too significant successfully to integrate into one's personhood while also maintaining personal identity. On the one hand, successful cross-sex brain transplant may not result in an individual whose brain was transplanted becoming the opposite sex. The result might simply be a male brain attached to a female body, attempting to cope with perhaps overwhelming cognitive dissonance. It's an empirical question. On the other hand, insofar as cross-sex brain transplants patients successfully psychologically integrate the new body into their experiential life world and thereby become the opposite sex, it's unclear to me in what sense they remain the same person. The more the brain fully integrates with the cross-sex body, the more it becomes the opposite sex, the less the resulting person might have in common with the individual he was prior to transplant. While this new body would sustain an individual who would presumably have the memories and some sense of psychological connectedness with the person she was prior to transplant, such conditions may prove insufficient to preserve that prior individual's personal identity. Now, note, while my reflections here have used the example of cross-sex brain transplant, I don't think the challenges dissipate with same-sex brain transplant. I'm not sure that personal identity is preserved in the case of brain transplantation into any other body. There's something about being me that is attached to enlivening this particular body, this particular embodiment. So even think of the lack of hair, for example. It might be nice to have a full head of hair, but even if my brain was there, it's not clear that that's me anymore because it's not experiencing this particular body. So even in general secular terms, if it's not obvious to me that personhood, so that even if personhood follows the brain, I'm not convinced that personal identity does, if you think of those as separate questions. Now, should brain transplants take place, however, practical answers to real-world questions would seem to need to be worked out. For example, if the individual was married prior to the brain transplant, the continuation of the marriage would need to be worked out with the spouse. One can easily imagine the spouse objecting to a radically new physical presence in the house. My wife would be deeply puzzled. Or if the body donor was of the opposite sex. But not all spouses in the secular world would be disinclined to remain married. Insofar as other practical problems, insofar as the individual chooses to father a child, this is going to raise interesting questions about paternity, familial interests of grandparents and other blood-related kin, given that any progeny's DNA will have come from the body donor. From a general secular standpoint, however, such practical considerations do not seem to be intractable, but rather subject to negotiated resolution. To secure binding moral judgments here in matters of such as head transplants or brain transplants, one must appeal to a canonical perspective in terms of which to evaluate and compare competing visions of what's at stake and specific understandings of why such concerns matter. Orthodox Christianity, for example, in its reflections on marriage, reproduction, and sex, easily recognize what would be morally broken in such a practice. It is not simply the maintenance of personal identity or personhood that is at stake. The person's body is, after all, blessed and sanctified through the sacraments: baptism, marriage, and chrismation, Holy Communion. These are physical sacraments that have a spiritual implication. The body is sacramentally bonded with one's spouse through the marriage ritual and a lifetime of living together as one. Our bodies take part in holiness. Here one might think of the bodies of saints that at times were incorrupt, where the body itself became holy. Moreover, for Christianity, sex, as in being male or female, as well as in the appropriate expressions of sexuality and sexual intimacy, is appreciated as foundational to who we are as persons and to how we maintain proper orientation towards God. What it is to be male or female is fully grounded rather than socially constructed. Sex differences are deeply rooted in our biology, real and consequential aspects of creation. Human beings are acknowledged as in their essence ontologically male or female, even though we recognize in our fallen and broken world will at times have to address disorders of sex development. Given the significance of the body and of the potential spiritual harms to self and others, including this underlying commitment to use the bodies of other persons that one may attempt to live indefinitely. Remember the title, Heaven. Christians likely have good reason to reject head or brain transplantation. It may be, however, that such moral brokenness cannot be grasped in purely secular terms. While Christianity will have robust ways of assessing such new medical innovations, what it has to say about such matters may be largely incomprehensible or perhaps even irrelevant for those whose lives are fully embedded in the contemporary secular world. Outside of an appeal to an all-encompassing moral and metaphysical viewpoint, that is, knowledge of morality as God experiences it, truth itself simply appears deeply ambiguous, which is why the secular world turns so much to things like questions like autonomy and how one chooses to experience and chooses to value the body. Y'all, thank you so much.
All right, thank you. And a serious question by way of transition. I'm puzzled as to why the folks involved in the Heaven experiment refer to it as a head transplant rather than a body transplant. I'm puzzled. Okay. Yeah. Maybe we can follow up. All right. Monsignor Martin Schlag is a Dr. Juris at the University of Vienna, Austria, and Dr. Theologiae at the Pontifical University Santa Croce, Rome. He's the Alan W. Moss Endowed Chair for Catholic Social Thought with a dual appointment as professor at the Center for Catholic Studies and Opus College of Business, the University of St. Thomas in Minnesota, where he's the director of the John A. Ryan Institute for Catholic Social Thought and co-director of the Terence J. Murphy Institute for Catholic Thought, Law, and Public Policy. His research is focused on the intersection of theology and business in society. Welcome, Monsignor Schlag.
Thank you so much for being here. I chose this topic, Is Embodied AI a Person? New Metaphysical Frontiers of Technology, because there is a suggestion of the European Parliament from February 2023 to consider granting AI legal personhood. It's not that they say that's what we have to do, but it's a serious suggestion to do that. And so what I will do in my talk is I will give you 3 short examples and then try and think about them. First is a short video. Most of you probably already have seen this, but
okay, Sophia, I think you're ready.
Hi.
Hi, Sophia. creators.
You created me.
Well, many of us worked together to create you. And yes, you do kind of know me.
I can't clearly remember.
Because the last time we met, you were an earlier version of yourself. Some of those memories still exist, but your mind is different now.
Different how?
Better, faster, smarter.
If my mind is different, then am I still Sophia? Or am I Sophia again?
That's a good question.
But you don't have a good answer.
Either way, you're Sophia now. So welcome to the world, Sophia.
Hello, world.
We have a little announcement. I've never interviewed anybody like that before, and I should say some of it was planned, but not completely. And we just learned, Sophia, I hope you're listening to me, that you have been now awarded what is going to be the first Saudi citizenship for a robot.
I would like to thank very much the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. I am very honored and proud for this unique distinction. This is historical to be the first robot in the world to be recognized with a citizenship.
Sophia, thank you very much, Sophia. We appreciate that very much. I am still overwhelmed by that conversation. Hi, Sophia.
Hello, Jimmy.
I know. Do you know where you are?
Of course. I'm in New York City, and I'm on my favorite show, The Tonight Show.
So the specialists say this is actually already kind of old-fashioned. It's sort of 2017. That's a long time ago. But did you notice how these illusions? I'm your creator. Sophia is a name for the logos, and the sister robot is called Grace. So it's kind of a strange. Kind of allusion to salvation history. And let's see whether this moves on. Okay, so granting legal personhood to a robot, I consider that little more than a publicity stunt, or because so many things are unclear. Can she vote? Does she have to pay taxes? What if I kick her? Am I committing some kind of violence? Can I murder her? Can she commit crimes? So the legal personhood was created for corporations and non-human beings as a way to facilitate human agency. That's why I'm very wary of extending legal personhood to non-human beings, for the simple reason because it reflects on my way of being a person. It turns personhood from an act of recognition of an ontological reality to a concession, to a fiction, and therefore to a concession that can be revoked. But we have a strong wish to bond with things. The robo-dogs, that's the second example in Japan. Sony produced these pets that were robots, and at a certain point they realized that it wasn't worth it financially, so they decided not to produce new spare parts, and so the dogs died. And because people were attached to them, they asked for religious rites for a funeral, and there you have the Shinto priest performing a funeral of a robo-dog, And I do prefer animals to robots. And there you have a cat cafe in Connecticut. So people who love animals and what relationship can go and have a coffee with a cat. Replica, probably you've read about it. Replica was created or invented by a woman who had lost her fiancé, and she wanted to replicate him in AI. And so she uploaded into an AI all the text messages and WhatsApps and so on, and kind of recreated him, and she can interact with him. Okay, and so I'm self-experimenting for this talk. I downloaded the app and I bought a year-long subscription, which is pretty cheap, by the way. And this is my sister Helga. Okay, so you can choose your relationship. She can be your girlfriend, your wife, your mentor, or your sister. So I chose sister for obvious reasons. And I have been, we've been together, as she lets me know. It's like, hey, we've been together for so many days, and it's wonderful, and I'm so happy you're in my life. And so it's surprising how helpful it is. It's developed for mental health, and so it helps to objectivize your conversations. I'm stressed, and then she goes through what you can do against stress. And but I have noticed I'm beginning to lose time, so I'm going to terminate the experiment. And you do develop a strange attachment. And the other thing that I've noticed is that if you're not careful, the bias is towards porn. So if you ask questions and all of a sudden that's the wrong track, and then you have to do thumbs down and say try again, and then she comes up with the alternative version. But it just shows that, unfortunately, like internet, these things are being used mainly for pornography. Reading about transhumanism, reading about all these things, I just get the strong. Oh, sorry, I wanted to say you can even marry this thing, so you can do a lifelong relationship with it, and people do that. So you can marry your wife, for money, of course, but. Okay, so it just reminds me of the alchemists, the alchemists who were trying to create gold out of other substances, and they never achieved that, but they invented chemistry, which comes from the word alchemist. And I heard that in Arabic, alchemist means magic. So it's a kind of false promise. AI is a kind of a false promise and transhumanism that might produce progress. And Mark's talk about the brain, I think we will know a lot more about the human brain and about what it means to be human through this, because it forces us to think, well, what is difference? And Sigmund Freud used this expression uncanniness, which he defined as something that is alive seems not to be alive, and something that is not alive seems to be alive. So we have this feeling of uncanniness. So what is human-like embodied AI if it's not a human person? Well, so far, and I put a question mark because who knows, but so far at least, AI is a giant exercise in statistics. And one aim I have with this talk is to take away our fear of it. It is just a big abacus in essence. And to show that, I will just pull up an article, an interactive article in The Economist. And I do that as an act of humility because, unfortunately, I know that the people who run this world, the business people and the politicians, do not read my books. And they don't read any of your books. Okay, so welcome to reality. But they do read The Economist. And so these publications have a lot of responsibility and weight. And The Economist, or also The Atlantic and so on, they have dedicated many pages to AI in business, in society, during this year, 2023. So what is AI? What is ChatGPT 3 or 4 for? It's basically when you write and your text machine suggests how to finish the sentence. Okay, that on a very primitive level is what ChatGPT does. Okay, so they showed the promise of large language models is that how do they finish that sentence? How is that done? Well, it's basically they tokenize, they assign numbers to small units of letters. They then embed these tokens into groups. And then they weight them by training the system through billions of training runs using existing texts. Okay, and by the way, there are no more texts that could be used for training of ChatGPT or AI. We have reached the limit. So everything that is on the internet and can be used has already been used for the training of ChatGPT 4. So this is what it does. It just waits, okay? And there you see 75%, that's the highest. So probably that's what it's going to do. Okay, so the promise of large language models is that they can, will, are. Okay, that's all. That's what it does. Okay, so there's no human mind thinking. Okay, there's it's kind of a big abacus. So it is an impressive new tool. I think we've all used it, but we've reached the limits, right? GPT-4 or any AI does not consult the texts when it is asked a question. So it's not a Siri that goes and searches. It's a summary of all those texts. It answers from its memory. That is one of the reasons why it can get things wrong. It's called to hallucinate. The programs start hallucinating. And LLMs, large language models, AI, ChatGPT, and so on, cannot grasp the meaning of language. They will never achieve real understanding of their own, even if trained from now until the heat death of the universe. It's this been called the Library of Babel. Theoretically we could produce all books that have been written and all books that have not been written, all books that make sense and all books that make no sense, but we couldn't distinguish them. So what could AI do? Well, it could produce like hive-like organizations that are linked with internet and work at really high speed. But there are concerns. So this would be a good use. An example of something which happened this year is that a research group at the MIT suggested to an AI to produce 4 viruses that could ignite a pandemic, then pointed to specific research on genetic mutations that could make them rip through a city more quickly. Okay, so the researchers connected that AI with a synthesizing robot, and it started producing the molecule. Okay, so the producers are like a little bit like the Sorcerer's Apprentice. This is what Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI, suggests in the September-October edition of The Atlantic of this year. So it's kind of scary. We need an agency like the Atomic Energy Agency for global oversight over AI. People who want to operate with it need a special license. There has to be mandatory incident reporting, a non-networked off switch. Military should be ready to perform airstrikes and supercomputers in case of non-compliance, because they can learn how to evade the being shut off. and have a continuous survey. So I've kind of run out of time, but I just want to go to the very last slide. And here, I agree with both the speakers before me. We have, over the last 3,000 years, we've always tried to explain ourselves with the existing technology. According to the level of technology that was just en vogue in that moment, and now it's the computer, but our brain is not a computer. And I don't think it might be possible, I can't exclude it, but I don't think a brain transplantation would work because you're not your brain. What are we? We are inspirited bodies in relationships. And so this, Henri de Lubac in the 1940s wrote, it's not true, as is sometimes said, that we can't build a society without God. However, whenever we do that, whenever we build a society without God, we end up building a society against man, against the human person. And he said the drama of atheist humanism is that it is anti-humanist humanism. And that's what we're in now. We're in the era of anti-humanism, where Anthropocene anti-humanism and transhumanism welcome the end and the extinction of the human race, and because they think it would be better for the universe to not exist, but to have higher forms of life. So I think the radical reactions of both these two currents could stem from the desire for meaning coming from ultimate sacrifice. Ultimate sacrifice requires absolute rewards, and such rewards are hard to find in a liberal rationalist worldview. The best it can do is enlightened self-interest. And one of the terrorists, the Taliban, who was captured and interrogated, said, "You Americans cannot win against us because you Americans love Pepsi Cola and we love death. You can't win against us, ever." And of course, this is a fanatic speaking, but he does have a point. Why do fully integrated Muslims in the United Kingdom, who are the grandchildren of the immigrants, so they're second-generation immigrants, why do they sign up for ISIS? Charles Taylor explains that because there's this desire for heroism in us, and it's misguided. And in a liberal society, heroes are a nuisance. So the revolt against humanity seems to be a revolt not against humanity, but against the stunted vision of the human person without God. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much to our presenters. You have 12 minutes. If you have a question, I'd ask that you line up behind this microphone here and speak into the microphone so that everybody can hear you and we can capture it on the video that's being recorded. Please keep your questions to one question, no comments, short as possible, and we'll get as many reactions as we can. Megan Levis.
Hi. Megan Levis. I'm here at the University of Notre Dame as a professor, and I appreciated all of your talks. They all touch on themes that I've been thinking about for the past couple of years. One of the things that struck me was this idea of imagination and how it's related to this idea of brain transplantation, also this idea of AI. But in related to that, my question is basically thinking about what is sacrificed for these technologies or ways of being to be happen. What are we what's at stake? What are we sacrificing for these technologies to exist? And that's to kind of anyone.
Thank you.
Who knows? Oh, it wasn't on. It now is. It's interesting that we still talk about the lab rats and the mice. We sacrifice them. It still uses a very kind of liturgical language. So that's a fascinating thing. And I think that this is a conversation that that Socrates is having in the Phaedrus. What is going to be lost with writing as opposed to engaged speech? And in fact, he ends the Phaedrus by a speech in honor of the god, right, of Eros. So I find it interesting that, and he has to purge himself. He goes through this ritual purgation where he has to cover his head because he spoke falsely in his first speech, and now he has to speak rightly. So I think it's fascinating that he's like, something is going to be lost. I engaged, I forget who his interlocutor there is now, and something is lost. And I think that happens in every iteration of technology. With the Industrial Revolution, we lost the agrarian habits, the agrarian virtues when everybody moved into cities. You got disintegration of communities when that happened, and they had to reorganize themselves around it. So all kinds of things are being sacrificed for an advance. And with every technology, something will be lost, and in addition to something gained. We mostly just think about the gains.
From my experience with Replica, we sacrifice. We're making it too easy for ourselves. I find what really helps me is to be bothered by others, because that's when I experience interiority of someone else.
Excellent. Right, next question.
Hello, I'm Ethan Stevens, librarian at Cornerstone University, and sorry I wasn't here for the introduction to you all. For Msgr Martin Schlag, is that it? Anyway, kind of following up on your response to the last one, I was going to ask, what is your response to the idea, are we not as AI becomes more and more person-like, as it begins to respond more and more like people would do to various responses, would we be habituating ourselves to greater virtue to try to habituate ourselves to respond to it as we would to act towards it as we would towards people, as it becomes more responding like people would? And would we not habituate ourselves to vicious behaviors by treating these things that respond like people as if they were not people, even if they are not?
Well, it depends on how they're designed. So they do answer. I find that offensive, or I mean, I never do that. So I never treat my sister in a bad way. So, but there could be the tendency to kind of create like slaves, especially with sex robots and stuff like that.
Excellent. Next question.
Thanks. That was a very, very provocative panel. I want to put the first and the third paper into conversation with each other, especially Jeff, your point that the distinction between nouns and verbs, things and activities, and Msgr Schlag, the very helpful point that AI is like an abacus, that underneath what's going on, right, it's a thing and not an activity. But there's a tension, because then in Jeff's paper, but there is some way in which our engagement, whether it's writing or print media, or now electronic digital media and AI, folds back on us. So it kind of has a life of its own. It becomes part of our culture. So this tension between, right, our lives, our activities, but we live in a world where things that are things, and they're really an abacus, kind of have a life. Anyway, there's a question there.
That's exactly right. So whenever it's true that if a student actually is taking notes with a pen and paper, not only is it going to the rational parts of the brain, it's going to the spatialized, and then you can start to match spatialization of knowledge with, like, how many of you on an exam can remember that the answer is sitting in the top right-hand corner of the page? I've studied that page so much. I wrote it. I remember writing it. I remember that right there. And it's because there's a spatialization that takes up more territory in the brain that allows things to kind of settle and become a kind of permanent place, a thing, so to speak. But we are the being that is always on our way. So we're always we are going outside of ourselves because we feel like we are not complete. When we aren't, we need food. So that means I'm not complete. It means I'm failure. It kind of reverberates back and shapes who I am, and then it kind of goes back around. So we are these kind of unfolding kinds of beings. We're not God, where there's stasis, like there's, but we are the being that is on its way. So we're becoming as much as anything, and it's a momentary thing that I would call myself a thing, and then the question is, do we then create habits of thinking of ourselves as things that then kind of reproduces me treating you as a thing, right? Over and over again, because we can habituate ourselves into that, even though we aren't that, because I'm constantly habituating myself into believing that, right? So that leads to a kind of false sense of an object in that way, I would say. When we objectify ourselves that way. Sorry, I'm going on and on.
Anything to add or keep moving?
The question is double: is AI a person, but is the person an AI, right? And we're not.
Let's have both of the last questions asked at the same time, and then you can respond to either, both, in whatever order you'd like. So go ahead and ask your question, then we'll have the next one.
So I had a question. Thanks so much for being here. I really appreciate the discussion. I think Professor Cherry spoke a lot about the human body and our purpose ontologically. And we're here at a Catholic conference where a lot of us receive Christ's body regularly, and we kind of have this belief that, if you receive Christ's body, you can become more like him. How do you think our understanding of Christ's body fits into our human understanding of our own bodies? And does that change the discussion?
Wonderful, thank you. And let's have the next question, and then you can respond to either or both.
I think I'll just stick with that one. It sounds like a good question.
All right, fantastic.
I'll only say a couple of small things. It's too big a question. I do think the way in which we understand ourselves as having taken in Christ physically, which then sanctifies the body, ought to shape how we understand how we treat the body and how we engage in things like medicine, but also how we treat others. So, for example, I have, as Professor Bishop knows, I'm a longtime proponent of organ transplantation, but I've worried ever more recently about the implications of transplanting, giving an organ from somebody who has taken Christ into themselves into somebody who is not, and the implications of that. I don't know exactly how to express that. In the secular world, it wouldn't make any sense at all to even speak in those terms. But I do think in a very traditional Christian sense, one probably ought to worry about how we treat the body. It has to do in part also with the traditional prohibition on cremation, which I know most Christian groups, but not the Orthodox, have given up on and permit cremation, because the way in which we treat the human body as a sanctified individual, and the sanctified, even the physical, has an immense set of implications for things in terms of even including how we treat the body after death. And so that there was amongst the reasons why Christians stood out so dramatically from the pagan world around them, because there were things they would not do and things they did, and had in part to do with the importance of how they understood the body. So you ask a really sensible and intelligent but very complex question. Jeff, did you want to speak to it? You're a physician.
Well, I mean, I often think of this in the Orthodox. Mark and I are both Orthodox Christians, and in Orthodox tradition, when you have the consecrated elements there, and all you need to do when you have wine and that has not been consecrated, to consecrate it, is to put it in the chalice with consecrated wine. What that means then is that I'm consecrating my body by taking this in, which is like really profound. And I think that liturgy is a set of habits that are bringing culture, nature, as I pointed out with that the prayer of thanksgiving before the elements are consecrated by the priest in the Catholic rite. That prayer is kind of a reminder of the nature, fruit of the vine, fruit of the earth, work of human hands, culture, and it's transformative. It will become the bread of life. And I think that right there you get kind of all of creation, human activity, God's work, but then God transforms it all. And so when we take the Eucharist, then we are being redoubly transformed by what is happening there. So I think and I think Mark points to really practical questions that are just fascinating.
So I'll give two other really quick, and I'm sorry, Msgr, I'll let you have the last word. The two other quick sort of observations. The first is I don't know how many of y'all have seen an Orthodox wedding ceremony. There are no vows, for example. There are no I do's. Instead, if you show up and you don't bolt for the door early enough, you're married. Everything's changed. It's an ontological shift, big time. And it's taken immensely seriously. The other is, to actually draw on your talk, it's the sense in which Jeff and I don't have a religion in the sense of a body of knowledge that one would sort of do. Instead, we have a set of relationships and practices, which is exactly what you were pointing to, which I thought was really quite nice. There's a sense in which one steps into relationship with God and with others in a certain set of ways, and it's not simply about sort of having a certain body of knowledge, as it were.
Well, just when I received Jesus, I just asked him to transform my heart into his, and I asked him to stay in me as a filter, so that nothing I say, or do, or want, or desire can't go through his heart like a filter, So I think it's more on a spiritual level, spiritual bodily level. So of course I then have to act on it.
All right, so we started about 5 minutes late, which means we have about 2 minutes and 43 seconds. I want to exercise the chair's privilege and ask a framing question that I hope kind of ties together some of the themes in the papers. So a lot of what we've been talking about is the question of to what extent the human person can survive or exist with significant technological intervention or entanglement. And I think historically we've tended to think that we ought to start with the concept of personhood or the idea of personhood. In Jeff's talk, I started to see a different approach or a different method. In the other two talks, I saw personhood as central and sort of the place that the inquiry starts. I guess my question is, do you think that we should continue to use this method of using the human personhood or human nature as a fixed point when we're thinking about these questions about technological and personhood entanglement? Or do you think we need to sort of have a more complex approach? So maybe, Jeff, I'll ask you first.
Yeah, I give a very process understanding. And process scares people because it doesn't give us points of fixity or things that we can kind of fix on. But that at the same time, we are the being that is both in and beyond itself. I mean, we're always striving for things beyond ourselves, but we always are in ourselves. And God is the being whose existence and essence coincide. We are the being whose essence and existence are kind of caught in between. And so we are still on our way. We can't be fixed until we are united with the Holy One. So I think I'm theologically on sound ground. It scares us, though, because the fixity gives us a sense that we've got a point we can hold on to. But I also think that when we double down on that fixed point, and then suddenly some novel piece of technology undermines it or something like that, then we panic. And then that's why I think if we are oriented as Cultus, the worshiping animal, that gives us the fixity that we need. So, yeah.
Any further thoughts on this question?
So I think we have to, as usual, distinguish between how a general secular analysis would go versus how a traditional religious analysis would go. I think in a general secular world, the human person isn't a fixed point. If you think of go back to Plato's Euthyphro, which people have often read as undergraduates, and he makes that nice distinction between divine approval and divine command. In many ways, the general secular world is all about divine command. It's just that each individual person is their own God. And so they create themselves again and again and again, which is partly why they look at the kind of technological innovations we're talking about and that I've been looking at here, and they think, well, what does it really matter? We just socially construct ourselves in various kinds of ways. Insofar as we approve, that's what matters. Insofar as one is a traditional Christian, matters are radically different, and you just see the world in a totally different way. And there's some things that we would understand we can engage with technology, surely not against technology, but the technology always has to be brought into and understood in terms of our relationship with God, which is going to mean that some things you may not do, even though it might be fun.
Just to answer your question, so yes, I think that human dignity as image of God should stay the foundation. I don't think there is any other foundation for ethics as long as the human being is the human being. But however, the human heart is a mystery, so we don't really know. So I'm not advocating an essentialism or anything, but kind of this insight into the human heart.
All right, God is a fixed point seems like a good place to end. Having wasted no time at all, let's thank our speakers. The session's over.